Welcome to today's webinar, Enbridge Line 5, Trouble Under the Surface. I'm Liz Kirkwood, Executive Director of Flow for Love of Water, the Great Lakes Water Law Policy Center based here in Traverse City, Michigan. I'd like to begin our event by sharing a water and land acknowledgement. For Love of Water is located on lands historically occupied by the Anishinaabe, Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor the ancestral lands of the Three Fires Confederacy, the sacred lands and waters of all Indigenous peoples and their continued presence. I am thrilled to present this webinar with our partners at the Oil and Water Don't Mix campaign. Today, you're part of an amazing live event and live audience of over 700 people who care deeply about Line 5, the Great Lakes, state and tribal sovereignty, energy and water security, and climate change. We're grateful for your time and interest, and we're delighted to be able to reach you through this free webinar supported by a generous gift from the Mackinac Island Community Foundation. Today's webinar is the latest in an ongoing series of Line 5 programming. By connecting you with our outstanding panel of legal and policy experts, we hope you'll come away from today's event more informed and inspired to take action. Events like ours today are important because Enbridge doesn't want people to know the truth about the condition of the pipeline. Before Michigan took Enbridge to court in 2019, Enbridge knowingly lied to state and federal regulators for years about the dangerous failing nature of the pipeline. Enbridge doesn't want you to know that a Line 5 shutdown will not send fuel prices soaring. Independent expert analysis has found that with advance notice and planning, energy markets will adapt without shortages or price spikes. Enbridge doesn't want you to think about how its giant new fossil fuel projects, like the proposed tunnel under the Mackinac Straits and the Wisconsin 41-mile reroute, are completely at odds with state, federal, and international goals to decarbonize and stem climate change. And Enbridge definitely doesn't want you to know that it is threatened by public pressure. But that's why it's blanketing Michigan and Wisconsin with ads that are a masterclass in greenwashing. In the span of just 1 month in early 2024, Enbridge spent over $100,000 on Facebook and Instagram targeting Michigan, Wisconsin, and Washington, D.C. Enbridge has unparalleled financial resources to throw behind its effort to extract profit until every last ounce of Alberta tar sands has been transported, refined, burnt, and sent skyward into our global greenhouse. This is what we're up against. But we are here to get into it and talk about where we are and where we go from here. I'd like to introduce our masterful moderator, Skip Press, who is Flow's senior legal advisor and an energy expert with decades of experience in both the public and private sector. Welcome, Skip.
Thank you, Liz. Welcome, everybody. Before we get started and I introduce our panelists today, I want to give you a very brief history of the twin 20-inch pipelines that traverse the Straits of Mackinac and sort of provide a context for today's discussion. So Line 5 and these segments will soon be 72 years old. And what we know about these pipelines and what we're learning more all the time is deeply concerning. For the first 50 years, these pipelines were essentially forgotten and ignored. It wasn't until 2001 when Enbridge started filing a series of, quote, emergency, unquote, permits with the state in order to support the pipeline. They learned that it was elevated. There were stretches of the pipeline that were suspended over the lake bed for more than 200 feet. That shouldn't have happened. It wasn't part of the engineering design. The 1953 engineering analysis, which for the time seemed remarkably thorough, was explicit in stating that the pipeline would sit on the lake bottom. that there would be very few chasms to cross, and any depressions beneath the pipeline could be filled in. That is not what happened. The 1953 engineering analysis didn't have data. There were no data about erosion of the lake bed from high velocity currents. And so there was never an analysis of the scour and erosion that would take place on the lake bed. So let's move forward in time. Today, there are 220 what are called screw saddle anchor systems that Enbridge has installed that suspend the pipeline over the lake bed for approximately 3 miles of its length, including directly below the shipping channel. The pipeline is now extremely vulnerable to anchor strikes and being hit by ships' cables. And predictably, that is exactly what has occurred. We've only been looking at Line 5, the Strait segment, since 2012, when Beth Wallace from the National Wildlife Federation issued the report Sunken Hazards. So in this 12 years of public scrutiny, we've seen the pipeline get struck by anchors. Both pipelines have been dented. The protective coating has been damaged. We have seen high voltage transmission cables severed by anchor strikes and the release of 800 gallons, we know this, of dielectric fluid, which is a chemical compound consisting of semi-volatile organic compounds. We found 2 anchors proximate to the pipelines, one of them being a 15,000-pound anchor, very, very heavy. We know that the maintenance work and the installation of the saddle anchor systems and the geotechnical work for the tunnel that Enbridge has conducted through contracted ships have also struck the pipeline as well. So there are multiple threats, and the potential of an anchor strike is not speculative. Looking at federal records, we understand that there have been at least 22 instances where anchors have struck submerged oil pipelines, resulting in severing of the pipeline and releasing oil to water. And we recently learned that it's not the case that only 1 or 2 Great Lakes freighters lose propulsion and power and steerage in the Great Lakes in any particular season and have to throw an anchor. That happens on average 20 times per year. Meanwhile, the scour and erosion of the lake bed is persistent and pervasive, and it requires the continuing addition of anchor supports. This was never contemplated. This is not part of the engineering design, and it's made the pipeline much more complex and much more subject to failure modes. So with that, I'm going to move to introducing our panelists that we have today. The first panelist is Riaz Kanji. Delighted that he has joined us. He is the founding member of Kanji and Katzen, a firm whose mission is to advance tribal sovereignty. He's a graduate of Harvard College and Yale Law School. Riaz served as a law clerk for Supreme Court Justice David Souter, and currently Riaz represents the Ban River Band in the fight against Line 5 in northern Wisconsin. Welcome, Riaz. Sean McBrearty is the campaign coordinator for Oil and Water Don't Mix and the Michigan director of the Michigan Clean Water Action. Sean works on water infrastructure, oil and gas, and drinking water issues. Sean has served as a leader in the campaign to decommission Enbridge's Line 5 pipeline for the last 6 years. Mahir Saruru is the director of the Beyond Fossil Fuel Policy at the Sierra Club. Mahir leads Sierra Club's federal policy team based in Washington, D.C. She manages the development and implementation of legislative and administrative advocacy efforts within the Sierra Club's Beyond Dirty Fuels campaign. Welcome, Sean. Welcome, Mahir. Before we start, just want to remind folks that you can type in your questions, text in your questions to us, and we will get to as many questions as possible. So first, Riaz, can you give us an overview of the state and federal litigation, and particularly the Bad River litigation, where finally we've had some success?
Thank you, Skip, and I want to thank Flo for organizing another terrific webinar, and to thank everyone for joining. It's always wonderful to have such robust audience for these sessions, and always look forward to the terrific questions. I will summarize both the Michigan and Bad River litigations briefly. The timing of this webinar is terrific, because on the Michigan front, and Skip, with your permission, I'll start with Michigan. We have, finally unequivocal good news out of the Sixth Circuit, the Federal Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, that Attorney General Nessel's lawsuit against Enbridge will be returning to state court. Last Friday, the Sixth Circuit reaffirmed its decision that Judge Neff, the federal district court judge, had no business keeping the Attorney General's case in federal court. Enbridge blew a deadline to remove the case to federal court by over 2 years, and the Sixth Circuit has spoken very clearly. Its mandate will issue this coming Friday, and I would expect that Judge Yonker, who's the new federal trial court judge on the matter, will then send the case back to state court expeditiously, so that Labor Day, I think, will mark a reset in the Attorney General's case in Michigan, and will mark a period of time where what should have happened all along, and of course it's frustrating that we've lost time, but that's water under the bridge at this point. The state will now be able to litigate its claims against Enbridge over the Straits Crossing, which are state law claims, in state court. Just one parenthetical, I imagine that Enbridge will seek to take the Sixth Circuit's decision up to the Supreme Court. That will be nothing. There are no guarantees in life or in litigation, but that will be nothing but a waste of time. That's the question about whether Enbridge blew a deadline or not is not a Supreme Court worthy question. So the case will be going back to state court. Before the case was wrested out of Judge Jamo's hands, there had already been a considerable briefing on the core issue in the Attorney General's case, which is whether, when the state issued the easement across the Straits of Mackinac in the early 1950s, whether that action was consistent with the public trust doctrine or not, a doctrine which is core to Flo's mission, and central to the Attorney General's case. So that issue's already been briefed up, and Enbridge's key defense, which is that regardless of what the public trust doctrine says, the Attorney General's action is preempted by various forms of federal law, including statute and including the 1977 Canada-U.S. Treaty. That issue has also been briefed up. I imagine that since that briefing took place several years ago, Judge Jamo may ask for supplemental briefing. The parties may want to update those briefs, but the core legal issues in the case, should be teed up for his decision making, within a matter now of months, not of years. So if you detect some excitement in my voice, it's because finally we may get to decisions on the merits with respect to the Attorney General's case sooner rather than later. One other parenthetical on the Michigan case, because you will see, you have seen and will see some press reports about this. Enbridge does have a parallel action in federal court in front of Judge Yonker. That is really nothing more, in my mind, than a nuisance lawsuit. Nuisance not in terms of environmental nuisance in terms of being a pest. Enbridge raises in that federal case all the same defenses that are at play in the state court. I think at this point the state court action will be further ahead in time than that federal action, and that's where we are likely to see decisions going to the substance of the Attorney General's claims first and foremost. So we have those developments on the Michigan side, positive developments, and then in our Bad River case, presently we are awaiting a decision from the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, based in Chicago. Arguments in the appeal were held in February. Many people attended, which we appreciated. In the wake of that argument, the circuit reiterated its request to the United States to file a brief on the key issues in the case. The United States had stayed silent, even in the face of the circuit court inviting its views ahead of argument. And so on April the 8th, the United States ended up filing a brief on some of the key issues, and we're now awaiting a decision. And just as a sort of a reminder, there are really three key issues that are in front of the circuit court on the appeal. The first and most important is the question whether the injunction deadline that Judge Conley set for the shutdown of the pipeline, which is June 16th, 2026, whether that date will stick or not. Judge Conley issued that shutdown order because of Enbridge's ongoing trespass on the Bad River Reservation. Enbridge has argued that the date should be lifted, that there is no trespass, and that even if there is a trespass, it's entitled to continue trespassing until such time that it builds a reroute or not around the reservation. To our disappointment, and I know we'll talk about the United States some today. To our disappointment, the United States weighed in and said, well, there are a lot of factors, and we know the band has treaty rights, and there's this treaty with Canada, and we think you should send this back to the district court to sort of reevaluate that June 2026 date. We, of course, argued that should be the latest possible date for a shutdown, and that it in fact should be tightened. But the point I want to make here today is that if the Court of Appeals affirms that June 2026 date, that's really, in the terms of the lifespan of this litigation and the lifespan of the pipeline, that is not that far away. That date is starting to feel very real. There will need to be steps that Enbridge and that this governments, federal and state governments, need to take to ensure the shutdown of the pipeline, and pressure from advocate groups and the public to ensure that those steps are taken will be very important to making that date stick. So that's one issue on appeal. The second is whether the other part of Judge Conley's order, where he provided for an earlier shutdown, if the Bad River continues to progress towards the pipeline, it's now 11 feet away. He said if it gets to 5 feet away, the pipeline needs to shut down immediately. Whether the circuit will uphold that part of his injunction. The United States, again, disappointed us there by arguing in its brief that federal law displaces the band's ability to get that sort of nuisance injunction from the district court. And the third and final issue is whether Enbridge will be required to pay a robust amount of restitution for the band for the trespass. And that's important in terms of deterring future trespasses by companies like Enbridge across tribal and other lands. So those are the issues that are teed up for a resolution. I would expect that we'll have a decision from the circuit within the next couple of months, almost certainly by the end of the year, but there's no fixed timeline for that decision making.
So, Riaz, Enbridge wants to reroute the pipeline around the reservation. Just assuming that they were able to do that, looking at the pipeline holistically, running from Wisconsin to Sarnia, Ontario, what is the prospect for what is the condition of that pipeline after 72 years, and the threat that the rest of the pipeline poses, not just the Bad River section or the Strait segment, but the pipeline as a whole?
Well, it's an excellent question, Skip, because we tend to focus on the straits and on the Bad River Reservation, because that's where there's ongoing litigation. But the situation at Bad River is instructive as to the risks across the 640-mile stretch of the pipeline. The slide we have in front of us, and it's difficult to decipher quickly, but this shows the migration of the Bad River towards the pipeline. The main blue is where the river was when the pipeline was laid in 1953, and the river and the pipeline were separated there by 350 feet. And if we go to the next slide, we will see that because of the natural migration of the river over time, what we now have is, you can see the bank of the river there, and the red line is the pipeline right of way. And the river is now only 11 feet away from the pipeline. So that's the natural erosion we've seen over time. And that's what led Judge Conley to say, if it gets much closer, if it gets to 5 feet, the pipeline has to shut down. Last spring, in the spring of 2023, 11 feet, the remaining distance, 11 feet of bank was lost in 1 week's worth of flooding. So we're really very close. This spring was a dry spring. There was no migration, but easily in 1 week next spring, we could lose that remaining bank. What has happened at Bad River with the migration, this is not the only place where this is happening. Line 5 crosses 400 rivers and streams on its path from Superior to Sarnia. Many of those rivers and streams are in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where the rivers or streams crossed flow into either Lake Superior or Lake Michigan. Line 5's route in the Upper Peninsula goes within 2 miles of the Lake Michigan shoreline, where think of where US 2 is, and this location, the Bad River location, because of our litigation, is far more monitored and scrutinized than many of these other crossings. So what we've seen at Bad River could easily be taking place at other locations, and one could have that sort of rupture there. And I think that's a risk that is underestimated and that we don't necessarily pay enough attention to.
Thank you so much, Riaz. Sean, moving to you. Enbridge, with all its resources, really has been able to control the narrative. Can you elaborate on the various vulnerabilities of Line 5 and the risk and the consequences of a pipeline failure, a breach?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Skip, and thanks for having me today. So, this has been so far over a decade-long effort in both Michigan and Wisconsin. We've been able to gather lots of facts and information about Line 5, and over the last, over a decade on this issue, we've seen Enbridge continuously change their story. It's like playing whack-a-mole, really. So, at first, for instance, so Enbridge has been really working to control the narrative here. What we know about the risks of the pipeline are very clear. This pipeline was intended to last 50 years. It's now 71 years old. We've seen that the last time, so when Governor Whitmer had the Michigan Department of Natural Resources look into the history of the 1953 easement, which let Enbridge operate across the Straits of Mackinac, the public trust lands there. That easement, it turns out the last time Enbridge was actually in compliance with the easement was in 1968. We've seen a history along this route that includes over 33 separate oil spills, totaling over 1 million gallons of oil spilled from this pipeline already. We've been lucky that there hasn't been a major spill in the Straits so far. And as you and Riaz both discussed a little bit, Skip, we've really seen over the years several opportunities for that to happen, including the 2018 anchor strike. Another big risk with this pipeline is purely Enbridge and their track record. Enbridge has a really negative track record that includes not only the 2 largest inland oil spills in U.S. history, and touching for a moment on the Kalamazoo oil spill here in Michigan, In that spill, it took Enbridge 17 hours to shut down their pipeline. Their command center misread their own equipment, and they thought initially that what was a break in the side of the pipeline was actually blockage. So they increased pressure and ran the pipeline for 17 hours. Nobody bothered to check. Nobody was thinking of the safety of the community. Nobody was thinking of the safety of our environment at Enbridge. They were thinking they needed to get their oil to market. And so they pushed, they wound up pushing more oil through a broken pipeline in Kalamazoo. Nothing has changed at Enbridge since then. What we saw in 2018, when a tugboat anchor very nearly cut through the Line 5 pipeline, putting 3 big gashes in the line in the Straits. What we saw then was it took Enbridge 2 weeks to get a remotely operated vehicle down to the bottom of the Straits and get an eye on the pipeline. Why did it take them 2 weeks? Because their ROV was in Florida. They didn't have one. They don't have, the common respect for a place that they're operating to even have a vehicle that can survey their pipeline here in Michigan where it could be immediately used. So things at Enbridge have not changed. They have a culture at Enbridge that does not take safety seriously. And that's why they're continuing to run a 70-plus-year-old pipeline through the Great Lakes. In the Straits, we see lots of problems that have also been identified, not only the risk due to anchor strikes, but the changed structure of the pipeline itself, with these support anchors and saddles, which are currently anchoring the pipeline to the bottomlands that were never actually designed to go with this pipeline. And there's never been an engineering analysis about whether taking a structure that's meant to sit on the bottomlands and intentionally elevating it could actually be done safely. We see new bends in the pipeline, likely caused by the fact that Enbridge has been out of compliance with their easement as far as span lengths of pipeline that have been unsupported for long amounts of time, and also possibly due to the new screw anchor design that nobody ever bothered to study. There's all of these huge risks associated with the pipeline, and with it running 23 million gallons a day, some of the worst case scenario spill numbers that we look at are, if it was the size of the Kalamazoo spill, a 1 to 1.1 million gallon spill. If they let this pipeline run for 17 hours after a spill, it could be orders of magnitude larger. So we're really looking at a big problem. Enbridge also, so Enbridge Inc., being the parent company up in Canada, has over 200 subsidiaries. Subsidiaries actually own Line 5, but profits flow up to Enbridge Inc. Liability remains with the subsidiaries. So if there's a major oil spill, and a study that the Attorney General's office commissioned in 2019 showed that the 2 subsidiaries that own Line 5 actually don't have their required $1.878 billion in liquid assets on hand to cover the cost of a spill. So the cost of a spill, which by the way would be a lot more than $1.8 billion, Flo has done some excellent analysis on that, along with Dr. Robbie Richardson at Michigan State. But if there were to be a spill, the cost for the spill would likely fall on Michigan taxpayers because Enbridge wouldn't be able to pay. So we're dealing with this culture of corruption at Enbridge. We're dealing with a 71-year-old pipeline with numerous safety issues and violations already. And, we're dealing with a lawless company at this point that is not only trespassing on Bad River territory in Wisconsin, but is also operating in Michigan without a valid easement for operating across the Straits of Mackinac. And Enbridge, as you mentioned, Skip, has also been able to control the narrative to a large degree here. When I said earlier, it's like playing whack-a-mole with Enbridge. If you go back to their arguments initially, it was that Line 5 was a very safe pipeline. They insisted that until the anchor struck it. And they also were claiming at one point that they provide 80% of the propane to the Upper Peninsula. Well, upon studying, we found out that number is actually closer to 65%, which sounds like a lot until you realize that out of the 130,000-ish households in the UP, about 30,000 of them rely on propane. And out of that 30,000-ish, about 12,000. I'm sorry, 20,000-ish rely on propane for heating. About 12,000 of those rely on propane that was once years ago provided by Line 5. So that's technically about 65% accurate, but 12,000 households is a very small amount of propane in the long run. And companies in the UP that actually provide the propane are already adapting. When it comes to other options for Line 5, there's lots of other options out there. First of all,
And Sean, let me ask you
yeah.
about that because this is an audience question.
Mhm.
So while we continue to litigate the shutdown of Line 5, why not support the building of the tunnel?
Yeah, thank you very much, Skip. So the building of the tunnel, there's several flaws with this plan. I'm going to start out with the very big picture flaw, and then we'll get into some of the more granular ones. The really big picture flaw is that we're in the middle of a climate crisis. Now, one of our colleagues is very fond of using this analogy. Could you imagine 10 years down the road from now, it's 2035, what things are going to look like in the world globally as we deal with the climate crisis, having a ribbon cutting ceremony for an oil tunnel underneath the Great Lakes? It just doesn't. Now is not the time. There never really was a time that would be a good idea to put an oil pipeline underneath the Great Lakes when we get to the big picture. But so number one, we'll get into this later. It's unnecessary to build a pipeline to build the tunnel because we don't actually need the product coming from Line 5. There are multiple industry studies that back that up that have been used in court. And actually, in the Bad River case, Enbridge's experts essentially agreed with our experts. So Enbridge, when they're not under oath and their propaganda machine is running here in Michigan and spending millions of dollars lying to the Michigan public, Enbridge says things like, they claim there's essentially going to be an apocalypse if we shut down this pipeline. But when their experts have to testify under oath, under penalty of perjury, they say that if the pipeline had to be shut down immediately, it might cost up to half a cent a gallon in regional gas prices. Nothing, because there's other options readily available, which we'll get into. Speaking of the tunnel, again, so back to the specifics of the tunnel. Experts in tunneling have serious questions as to whether or not this tunnel could actually be built. Enbridge has done about 1/10 of the industry recommended geotechnical research. In that 1/10 of the research that they did, looking into the rock they're intending to drill through, they found that over half of the rock samples that they took rated somewhere between poor and very poor for drilling. They found out that the water infiltration you should expect into the tunnel during construction is actually the same as the water infiltration you would expect through gravel, not bedrock, because they're not actually drilling through bedrock. They'll be mixed face tunneling through this, which is the most complex type of tunneling there is. They've also done nothing to address the fact that they found methane in the groundwater as they were doing their, again, 10% of the industry recommended research. The largest tunneling accident in Michigan history was back in 1973 when they were drilling a new water intake tunnel under Lake Huron. And the crew drilling the tunnel, unfortunately, somebody dropped a drill or something after they had struck a methane pocket. The blast killed 23 workers. If we see something like that with Line 5, not only could we have, they're intending again to drill this underneath an existing operating oil pipeline. Not only could we see a giant oil spill into the straits if they hit a methane pocket, and again, they have not done the required research to show that they won't hit a methane pocket, but we'll also potentially see loss of life inside the tunnel, and nobody wants that to happen. There's all sorts of things with the tunnel that just Enbridge hasn't answered the questions. As one of our experts is fond of saying, Enbridge has no history of building tunnels. They are ditch diggers. They dig 6 feet down, put a pipeline in the ground, and cover it with dirt. When they've had to do more than that, when they've done the directional drilling in Minnesota in the summer of 2021, when they forced Line 3 through indigenous lands, their directional drilling techniques failed over half the time. They breached artisan aquifers. They had drilling mud spills left and right. It was Keystone Cops up there with Enbridge. These are the people who we're going to trust to build a tunnel under over 90% of the world's fresh water. Or not
Okay,
even
Sean.
North America's fresh water? It doesn't make a
Thank
lot of
you.
sense.
Thank
Thank you.
you. And thanks to you and Oil and Water Don't Mix for all the expertise that you have. Just a quick question from the audience. Can you reiterate, has Enbridge hit the pipeline themselves while surveying for their tunnel proposal? The answer is yes, they did. They also tangled a cable with an anchor support and pulled it out of position. That has happened a number of times. Also, a ship under contract to Enbridge struck the Mackinac Bridge, and 4 crewmen were injured. So, yeah, it's as the National Transportation Safety Board chair said, they're a bunch of Keystone cops. That's a quote. So, moving on. Mahyar, you in the campaign Beyond Fossil Fuels, you spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C. Can you go over the efforts that you have led and the delegations that you have led to various federal agencies in support of shutting down Line 5?
Sure. Thank you, Skip, and thanks, Flo, for hosting this webinar today. Hi, everyone. My name is Mahyar Saru. I'm the Director of Beyond Fossil Fuels Policy at the Sierra Club, and so glad to be here with you all today. So as my colleagues have laid out, we know Line 5 is an aging, deteriorating, unsafe oil pipeline that poses catastrophic risks to the treaty-protected lands, pristine natural resources, valuable freshwater sources, including the 400 rivers, streams, and wetlands and farmland that it cuts through. We know a pipeline failure in the heart of the Great Lakes threatens the drinking water of millions of people. This is why a coordinated and collaborative focus on the Biden-Harris administration is needed to end this threat to the Great Lakes, our climate, and tribal sovereignty. We know the Great Lakes is a national treasure and it must be protected. And so the movement to shut down Line 5 has been growing due to the efforts of folks on the ground in Michigan and Wisconsin who have been leading the way. But we know to win, this campaign must be elevated at a national level, just like the fights have on Keystone XL and the Dakota Access Pipeline. Just as President Biden revoked the presidential permit for the Keystone XL pipeline, he can revoke the presidential permit for Line 5 and shut this pipeline down. But our efforts to make the case to revoke the presidential permit continue to be an uphill battle, as there have been concerns raised around what impact shutting down Line 5 will have on our national security, and specifically our relationships with Canada. But as long as we as a country rely on volatile global commodities like oil and gas, we'll always be vulnerable to the whims of greedy fossil fuel companies who continue to lie and cheat their way to prolong the dependence of fossil fuels, just like Enbridge. That is why investments we've seen across the country in clean energy will increase our energy supply and help accelerate the production of cheaper, cleaner energy here at home. We know the best way to achieve energy independence is to invest in wind and solar and clean energy here in the United States. But besides our efforts to stop to shut down Line 5 and revoke the presidential permit, we know there are multiple federal intervention points to stop this pipeline. The Army Corps of Engineers is currently seeking comments for its draft environmental assessment for Enbridge's Line 5 in northern Wisconsin. And thanks to the leadership of congressional champions, national and grassroots organizations, we have seen outreach to the Army Corps, naming the inadequacies of this draft EA, calling on the Army Corps to include climate impacts, oil spills, and impacts on Indigenous tribal lands for the full route of Line 5. And we know ultimately the Army Corps of Engineers must conduct a full environmental impact statement for the reroute in Wisconsin, not just this inadequate EA. And the same goes for our advocacy for the tunnel project in Michigan. We know the scope that the Army Corps has already released for looking at the EIS, the environmental impact statement for the tunnel project, is inadequate. And the risks associated with building a tunnel to surround Line 5 in the Straits of Mackinac are too high. Ultimately, the Army Corps of Engineers has the authority to reject permits for both the tunnel in Michigan and the reroute in Wisconsin. And there's been a growing number of congressional members who've been speaking out against the dangers of Line 5, but that number must keep growing and go further than just the Michigan and Wisconsin congressional delegations as we nationalize the Line 5 campaign. And other federal agencies besides the Army Corps have a role to play here. The Environmental Protection Agency, the Council on Environmental Quality, both have opportunities to use their oversight authority on the Army Corps process and ensure the process they're taking with the reroute and the tunnel project are adequate. With CEQ's most recent National Environmental Policy Act regulations, we know federal agencies like the Army Corps must consider the indirect, direct, and cumulative impacts as they permit projects, and that climate and environmental justice are key pillars in agency decision-making. And as the federal agency in charge of pipeline safety, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA, must have a more robust emergency response plan, because we know it's not a matter of if the Line 5 pipeline will have a failure and leak in the Great Lakes, it's a matter of when. And when we talk about what a transition to a clean energy future looks like, that transition means having a plan for decommissioning old, deteriorating pipelines, which we in the United States do not have a plan for. And because we know our vision for our future is not building more tunnels around pipelines or extending the lifeline of a pipeline to lock us into fossil fuel dependence for decades to come. It's harnessing the federal investments from the infrastructure law, the climate benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act, and transitioning away from fossil fuels towards a clean energy future.
Thank you. That was fantastic. So we know the Canadian government is an active, powerful advocate on behalf of Enbridge. What is the posture of our administration, and what positions are they taking?
Well, we've seen some conflicting views from the administration right now on Line 5, right? Just as Riaz laid out, the amicus brief that we saw from the administration, while included some positive aspects, naming the climate pieces of this project, naming Enbridge, as a bad actor, ultimately we have not seen the type of action from the Biden-Harris administration on Line 5 that we hope to see. And a lot of that continues to be the conflicting views within the administration on what we should be prioritizing, climate versus national security. And ultimately, those positions, those conflicting positions are not new. In another case, right before the weeks and the months leading up to the Biden administration directing the Department of Energy to pause any new approvals for liquefied natural gas export authorizations, we saw conflicting views within the administration on whether we should support such a pause or what we should do to stop the unfettered build out of LNG exports. And ultimately, it was climate versus national security. And I think in the case that we saw there, the administration did the right thing, put a pause on those new authorizations while the Department of Energy updates the process by which to make LNG exports in the public interest. And I think our efforts, while they continue to be an uphill battle, are just the same. We know the case for Line 5 is clear. The risks associated with this pipeline, whether it be the climate, environmental justice, or treaty rights, we believe far outweigh any sort of national security implications. And ultimately, we don't really believe there are any national security implications. When this pipeline is being used to transport from one end of Canada to another, what benefit is it actually providing to us in the United States besides prolonging the use of fossil fuels?
Thank you. Riaz, I'm going to come back to you, but before I do, there's an audience question. Has any consideration been given to requesting courts to order Enbridge to put in escrow enough funds to clean up after a spill in the lakes? Just want everyone to know that the Governor Whitmer and Dana Nessel and the director of the Department of Natural Resources have all made a demand to Enbridge, the parent company, who is not the owner of the pipeline, to directly indemnify the state in the event of a spill, and to name the state as a co-insured on whatever insurance policies they have. Enbridge refused to do either of those things. Riaz, Enbridge has interposed the 1977 treaty as a barrier to moving forward into litigation or as a legal issue, taking the position that that treaty ensures the free flow of hydrocarbons back and forth between Canada and the United States. The Department of Justice makes much of respecting the sovereignty of nations. Why is the Canadian treaty seemingly have primacy over the treaties with indigenous nations in this country?
Thank you, Skip. Another excellent question. The answer is that the 1977 treaty, as a matter of law, does not have primacy over tribal treaties. The law is very clear on this, and Judge Conley issued a nice ruling on this in the Bad River case. Tribal treaties may only be abrogated by Congress, and they may only be abrogated by Congress where Congress is very clear that that's what it intends to do. And we have two sets of operative treaties that, with respect to Line 5. One is Bad Rivers treaties that enshrined its reservation and gave it dominion over its reservation, and that preclude trespass of the sort that Enbridge is engaged in. And then in Michigan, we have the 1836 Treaty of Washington, which gives the tribes, secure to the tribes, fishing rights in the Straits of Mackinac and land rights in exchange for millions of acres of cession. The Congress has never abrogated either treaty. The 1977 Pipeline Treaty says not one word about tribes or tribal treaty rights, so that treaty does not abrogate the tribes' treaty rights. And so Judge Conley was exactly right in saying that these arguments based on the 1977 Pipeline Treaty do not override the tribal rights at play. And one of our disappointments in the United States in its briefing is that it just did not come out and say that very clearly.
Thank you. There's a question, when should we see a court date in the Michigan courts? I think you may have answered that.
Yeah, I saw a few questions, and as always, they're just excellent questions in these webinars. I saw a few questions related to court proceedings, details I didn't get into. On the Michigan front, we don't have fixed deadlines. As I said, I think Judge Jamo will call for supplemental briefing, or the parties themselves may ask for supplemental briefing on this core question in the Attorney General's case, which is whether the issuance of the pipeline easement in the first instance violated the public trust doctrine, and then Enbridge's defenses. And I know people get very frustrated with the legal system and how long things take. My guess, and these are very rough, is that the briefing on those issues, if there's supplemental briefing, will play out over 2, 3, 4 months. After the case returns to state court, Judge Jamo, who's a very good, careful judge, will then likely hold a hearing and will then issue a decision. So if you add all that up, one could be talking 4, 5, 6, 7 months, something like that, before we start getting decisions on the merits.
Thank you. Thank you. Mahyar, a question from the audience. What support have we received from Pete Buttigieg, who is a local Traverse City resident here, from the Transportation Department?
It's a great question. So, I mean, ultimately, Pete Buttigieg, as the Secretary of Transportation, his department, his agency sort of oversees PHMSA, as we talked about, right? The Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, the really lead agency for overseeing pipeline safety. And ultimately, at this point, our efforts with them have continued to be an uphill battle. I mean, we've seen that PHMSA say that they don't really have, jurisdiction to deal with shutting down a pipeline. And ultimately, I think we have concerns around how PHMSA views handling a pipeline failure, and what does actually a failure look like and a leak look like. And ultimately, I think for us, we believe that federal agencies should have mitigation measures in place to avoid a pipeline spill and have plans in place to avoid a pipeline spill, not just respond when a pipeline has already failed. So ultimately, I think we have some work to do in terms of our advocacy with PHMSA and ultimately Secretary Buttigieg as head and overseeing that entire agency, that there is more there as well. But in the past, we have seen Secretary Buttigieg tweet support for shutting down Line 5. I believe when he was running for president, but we haven't really seen him address Line 5 since. So I think more to come there, and would welcome my colleagues to jump in as well.
Skip, can I put a sharp point on what Mahi said from the litigation point of view, which is I think at present, and everything Mahi said is exactly right. I think at present we have the worst of all worlds when it comes to PHMSA and the Department of Transportation and what the administration the stance is taking on these issues. Because on the one hand, PHMSA is not actually doing anything to shut down Line 5 or to ensure that we don't have a rupture at any one of these many locations where we could have a rupture. And on the other hand, as we saw in our Bad River case, the administration came in and argued that even though PHMSA isn't doing anything, that our claim about the meander, the slides I showed, that claim is displaced, that the shutdown order Judge Conley placed in the 5-foot threshold, that is improper as a matter of law because PHMSA has authority over these issues. So the agency that's not actually doing anything because they have theoretical authority, that means that the Bad River Band can't take the steps it's taken to protect itself there. And another place where the administration will now be put to the test will be here in Michigan, where Enbridge is arguing that Michigan's claim is preempted because of PHMSA's authority under the Pipeline Safety Act. The administration has not weighed in on that yet, and I think this is one area where public pressure and advocacy will be very important to ensure that the administration doesn't end up arguing that what the Attorney General is doing and what Governor Whitmer has said are precluded by virtue of this theoretical authority in PHMSA that PHMSA doesn't actually exercise.
Thank you. At the end of this webinar, we will talk about how citizens can engage and what they might be able to do to help us move forward on this. Sean, can you talk about the Great Lakes Business Network? There's over 200 companies now that are signed up and are committed to try to help and use their influence to shut down Line 5. Who's the Great Lakes Business Network? How is it formed and where are they going?
Yeah, so the Great Lakes Business Network is, a really excellent coalition of businesses, mainly here in Michigan. A lot of our really important industries here in the state are represented. Everything from farms and, especially some of our cherry farmers up north who are bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate change this year with, the unfortunate cherry harvest that we had. As well as some of Michigan's breweries, all sorts of different industries that rely on the Great Lakes for water. And these businesses came together, again, about a decade ago when people really started organizing and agitating around Line 5. And they've been a very important part of our coalition to, raise the voice of Michigan businesses when, so often this gets painted as a business versus the environment thing, when really it's one giant bully of a corporation against the people of several states, the indigenous tribes of several states, and importantly, the business community, the people who, I think of folks like Bell's Brewery and Cherry Republic and some of the other great partners of Great Lakes Business Network who have started really good, successful businesses that bring great things to our communities. We need business. We don't need businesses like Enbridge who take advantage of our people. We need businesses like folks in the Great Lakes Business Network. So everybody should check them out. And when you can, please frequent these folks. They're, really great partners in this fight. And they they lead with their values and value our state and our natural resources.
Thank you, Sean. Riaz, a question has been asked. Liz commented that closing line 5 would not cause fuel shortages and we could avoid price spikes with appropriate planning. Can you talk about the experts report that you developed with your team and what it concluded?
Sure. So I'll do and I see that there are a fair number of questions about oil and propane supply. I'll do my best in a very short amount of time to summarize where the expert evidence came out at our trial in the Bad River case. And what I want to emphasize really are 2 points, because we hear a lot about how if Line 5 shuts down, that will cause massive price increases, shortages, hardships, both in Canada and for people in the upper peninsula. The evidence, the uncontroverted expert evidence, demonstrates, I think, unequivocally that none of that is true. And I'll focus first on oil, crude oil, with two simple steps. With two simple steps, the vast bulk of the crude oil that's supplied by Line 5 could easily be replaced. So even if one's goal, and I want to be clear about this, even if one's goal is to replace every drop of oil that's supplied by Line 5. So even if one thought that was good public policy to keep burning all the oil, that can be done, and the markets would do it. And the two simple steps are there's over 100,000 barrels a day of excess capacity on Enbridge's Line 78, which runs into Sarnia into the same point from the same beginning point. That's unused capacity. And secondly, two refineries in Quebec, which receive a great bulk of Line 5 oil, already take oil in the St. Lawrence Seaway by tanker and could take more, which they did until 2016 when Enbridge reversed its Line 9 pipeline. This is not coming from me or our experts, but from Enbridge. This is the other point I want to stress. From Enbridge's expert at trial and in an expert report prior to trial, was very clear that those are two mechanisms that can be used to replace the great bulk of the oil. And this is why that expert, and again, this is Enbridge's expert, not ours, Neil Ernest, testified that if Line 5 were to shut down, the net effect on prices in Michigan and Wisconsin, which would be the two most affected states, would be 0.5 cent to 1 cent per gallon of gasoline. I want to repeat that, 0.5 cent to 1 cent a gallon. That's obviously an amount that is lost in the noise of daily fluctuations in gasoline prices. And the reason why he said that is because of what I just said. There are replacement mechanisms. There are also a robust network of refined oil pipelines in this country. So the scare stories are not true. Propane is a separate issue. And what Mr. Ernest testified there, and of course, in Michigan, we all have concerns about the Upper Peninsula and residents there, that within 6 months for the investment of $5 million, one can build rail offloading terminals that would offload the amount of propane necessary. You could build 2 or 3 of those terminals in the Upper Peninsula to replace the Line 5 supply of propane, which is not large in volume in the Upper Peninsula. Rail is the principal means by which propane is imported from Canada, so this is not some radical a new idea. So there again, the facts undermine any sense that Western civilization will come to an end if Line 5 is shut down. Last thing I'll say on that is there's an excellent report for anyone who's interested in the facts by the Professional Logistics Group, which is an industry group of consultants that was put together after our trial that summarizes all the various ways in which the market would replace the supply of both crude oil and propane. And I think a link to that may be available or could be provided on the Flow website.
Yeah, so the pipeline network in North America is such that we could easily reroute and recalibrate the system and make up for it, any shortfalls. I just stepping back, recall that when Russia invaded the Ukraine, there were global reports of the consequence that would follow to European nations with shortages of gas and fuel and oil, and that entire European system was able to recalibrate in a period of months and avoid those shortcomings. Okay, I have a question. All of you can jump in on this. So the Great Lakes system is the most extraordinary, most valuable fresh surface water system in the world, bar none. And Michigan sits at the heart of it. The Straits sit at the heart of the system. What do we know about the dispersion modeling that has been done? What I mean by that, if there is a failure of line 5, if the pipeline is breached, what happens to the oil, and then what happens to the coastal communities, the businesses that are water dependent, the drinking water supplies in the area, that sort of thing? Sean, you want to take it first?
Well, Skip, I'm sorry, my screen froze for a second at the end of your question. Can you just repeat the end?
Just what is the consequence of a line 5 failure in terms of the oil released and how it moves from Lake Huron to Lake Michigan, and how coastal communities would be affected, drinking water supplies in the area, that sort of thing?
Okay, excellent. Thank you. That's what I thought you were getting at. So to begin with, Enbridge claims that they can shut down, or that once they initiate shutdown, it takes 3 minutes to complete shutdown. On top of that, they claim that they can detect a pressure drop, et cetera, and have that all sorted within 20 minutes. So according to them, the minimum time that we're talking a pipeline would be running during an oil spill is about 23 minutes. A pipeline that runs roughly 1 million gallons an hour, running for 23 minutes, creates a very large oil spill. And again, this is the company that let the Kalamazoo pipeline, or the Line 6B in Kalamazoo, run for 17 hours. So I think a charitable estimate of a spill size, if that were to run for, let's say, an hour, would be about 1 million gallons. If they're spilling 1 million gallons, one of the big problems that we have with the pipeline's location in the Straits is that Lake Huron and Lake Michigan are one body of water. They slosh back and forth at the Straits of Mackinac. So at the peak flow of water through the Straits, we're talking 10 times the flow over Niagara Falls, moving through the Straits of Mackinac. It's a lot of water. It moves very quickly, and it changes direction. The flow of the water changes direction 180 degrees, with the lakes going back and forth on average every 1 to 3 days. So it's a very volatile part of the Great Lakes ecosystem. Now, theoretically, if you were to try to clean up an oil spill, and I say theoretically because the best the oil industry has ever done in cleaning up a spill in open water has been to clean up about 20% of the total volume spilled. They consider 30% of any oil spill to be a very successful cleanup. Now, so theoretically, if they were able to to have everything in place when an oil spill happens, which we know they don't have right now, and be able to get everything out there, they could try to contain this. The problem is the skimmers and the booms and the other technology that they have for cleaning up an oil spill is only effective in 3-foot waves or less. So any waves over 3 feet, you're pretty much out of luck, and we'd be left with oil spreading for as much as over 700 miles of Great Lakes shoreline in the case of a 1 million gallon spill. So, that would be absolutely devastating for the Great Lakes. Some of the initial impacts would be that, it would impact the water intakes for Mackinac Island and for other communities in the Straits region. This would threaten the drinking water for pretty much everyone who relies on a drinking water source from Lake Michigan in northern Michigan. So the effects here would be really catastrophic when we think about the possibility of an oil spill at the Straits. And it's also important, I think, to include that even if the tunnel was a perfect plan, which again, we know it's not, we're talking about a 4.5-mile Band-Aid on a 645-mile problem. The whole pipeline is 20 years past its intended lifespan. And there's places where that pipeline runs, especially through the Upper Peninsula, where it's running right along the shore of Lake Michigan and over rivers. And a spill from there could be almost as devastating as a spill in the middle of the Straits.
I just might add on that the thickness of the pipeline, the submerged pipeline that crosses the strait, is 82 hundredths of an inch. The rest of the 640 miles of pipeline is 1/4 of an inch, slightly less than 1/4 of an inch. So it's 72 years old and much thinner. So thank you so much. That was so enlightening. Really appreciate it. Turning this back over to Liz and Sean.
Thanks, Skip. Thank you, Riaz, Mahayar. Sean and I are going to just go back and forth and share some citizen actions for you to take now and then to continue to engage. So, Sean, I'll let you lead the way.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, we really need all hands on deck. There's things going on all the time with Oil and Water Don't Mix. We have, in fact, a day of action. We have days of action just about every month. We also have a monthly volunteer campaign call, which happens on the first Tuesday evening of every month. So go to our website, oilandwaterdon'tmix.org, sign up to volunteer, get on those monthly volunteer calls so you can find out what's happening in your area and come support and help us out. It took a grassroots army to get to the point where Governor Whitmer revoked the easement, and it's going to take all of us pushing to keep this on the right track.
I just add to what Sean said is that we know that each of you have your own gifts and you can volunteer in incredible ways. And you don't need to be an engineer or, communications expert. It's the incredible power of the people has been transformative in this campaign. As you know, we are in the height of the election season, and showing up with to any kind of candidate events and rallies with Line 5 signs and merch would be awesome. And you can order this online, and we're going to provide a link right there on your screen. Don, back to you.
Thank you, Liz. And another so another option that we have on the Oil and Water Don't Mix site, again, you can sign our petition to our Secretary of Transportation, and again, Traverse City resident Pete Buttigieg, where we're asking him to use his role at DOT to do more to shut down Line 5. And back to you, Liz.
Thanks. And through August 30th, you can submit your comments to the Army Corps about Enbridge's Wisconsin 41-mile reroute of the pipeline proposal. And this is important. It doesn't matter if you're a Wisconsin citizen or not. Michigan residents can weigh in. And you can see here on your screen, we've got the link to sign and submit your comments. And we would encourage you to take this action and ask 3 people to also submit their comments. We will send all of these actions to you in a follow-up email in case you have not gotten it, so have no fear. And like Sean said, the most important thing is to continue to stay engaged, because the advocacy continues and your voice is fundamental to our success. So I want to just end by personally thanking each and every one of you for your outstanding questions and commitment. A special thanks to our amazing panelists and moderator for sharing their experience and deep knowledge on this matter to inspire us to work together for the future of the Great Lakes. And a huge thank you to the Mackinac Island Community Foundation, who made this webinar possible. We're going to follow up with you the next week with the links to recording of the webinar and related resources, and of course, the Line 5 actions that you can take and share. We have a small favor to ask. We just would ask you to fill out a brief survey that's going to pop up at the end of the webinar and also be available in the email. And please know that we really care so much about your responses, because it helps us develop future Great Lakes webinar webinars and other programming. So I want to leave you with this final thought, which is that, our movement to shut down Line 5 is growing stronger because of you and your commitment to take action and spread the word. Today, we've had over 700 people register for this webinar and countless others who will watch it on demand over the next coming weeks and months. While Line 5 continues to wind its way through the court system, it's more important than ever before for you to voice your opinion in a showing of solidarity with the state of Michigan and the tribes to protect our rights to water. And continue to educate your friends, neighbors, family, because the will of the people will influence the future of Line 5. Collectively, our voices matter in this fight to protect the Great Lake, and I hope you come away from today's event feeling more knowledgeable, empowered, and motivated for change. We also hope that you'll consider donating to Flow and to Oil and Water Don't Mix. Your support helps us continue our legal and advocacy work in this campaign to shut down Line 5 and get the oil out of the Great Lakes. We thank you again for attending and taking action to protect the Great Lakes, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.